Monaco without the walls. That's the name that's been attached to the Hungarian Grand Prix for as long as I can remember, and I feel it's a little bit unfair nowadays given the race has actually been rather interesting as of late. With the sport coming off the hopium of back-to-back Mercedes victories, delusion was rife as the sport headed to Budapest and the 13th round of the 2024 season. Despite the circuit looking like it was preparing for powerboat racing on Wednesday afternoon, temperatures were expected to soar for the Grand Prix weekend, throwing tyre strategy and Haas's hopes for third consecutive points finish well and truly out of the window. With the heat expected to reach peaks of 35 degrees, guess it's a good thing I, as the world's whitest man, hadn't picked this to be my only live round of the season. Oh wait. This week's driver news kicks off at Haas, who announced they'd be dropping Kevin Magnussen at the end of the season, an announcement that may be surprised about 3 people. Rumours were also swirling around Red Bull, with Sergio Perez, despite signing a 2-year deal ahead of the Canadian Grand Prix, realising that said 2-year deal was copied from McLaren's IndyCar HR office. The biggest news of the week, though, had to be that future Ferrari teammates Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton allowed their dogs to meet each other for the first time in the paddock. Apparently Christian Horner wanted to join the party as well, but Daniel Ricciardo didn't qualify. While all this was going on, I was on a mission not to get touched up by Heathrow security, and upon achieving that, got to the departure lounge just in time to realise my flight was delayed due to the power of God or some In hindsight, given this was just a day before the CrowdStrike chaos, I actually got pretty lucky. Anyway, I would touch down an hour and a half behind schedule and hop in a cab ride to my accommodation for the weekend. Also on the subject of said cab ride, I'm starting to realise that the speed limits over here are apparently more like suggestions. This guy was literally doing double while ironically on the phone to a guy whose contact claimed he was the police. With it now being 2 in the morning, it was just a short sleep before we hopped into another kamikaze cab, walked up a hill and arrived at the circuit, just in time for FP1 to get underway. I'm not too sure how much we can really take away from this one, given some teams spent it with the blue screen of death, Sainz topped the session for Ferrari, and Slow was something like 5th. The Saubers were sporting a raft of new upgrades, and I think raft is quite an appropriate word given that the future Audis handle like that boat that blocked the Suez Canal. They weren't the only team sporting new parts in the Budapest heat, Red Bull giving only Verstappen a new engine cover, as it seemed far more sensible just to wait until Perez breaks his current one. Aston Martin also brought improvements to its AMR24, running them on Alonso's car during opening practice, which made the Spaniard want to kill himself. We'd hope for a more representative session during FP2, as Lando Norris gave the 5-year-old some false hope by topping the session in his McLaren. The Briton has a new helmet design for this weekend, modelled after the Hungarian Grand Prix trophy he vandalised last year, as perhaps a reminder not to lose his head at any point over the weekend. Let's hope that doesn't age poorly later on. As the Papaya cars look set to challenge at the front, things were going less well for Charles Leclerc, taking aim at the marshals on the exit of Turn 4, who were spared thanks to Qatar Airways, who are the proud sponsor of this video. No, I'm joking, that would have been quite a cool segue though, wouldn't it? That crash served as inspiration for Slow, who almost did the same thing and put Sergio Perez out of his misery. Also, I love how, according to the Chinese driver, this was apparently Checo's fault. That ended Friday's action and took us forward into a much cooler and therefore much needed Saturday. Norris continued to show form by topping FP3, Oscar Piastri coming in close behind in P2. With nothing really happening here, I took the opportunity to venture out of my grandstand and join the peasants, general admission in the hills surrounding the Hungaroring circuit. Apologies, I'd let my inner Liberty Media get out a bit there. That gave me some stunning new angles to watch Lewis Hamilton stack it in the final sector, and this seems like the perfect time to plug my photography Instagram, which I've resurrected for the time being and is down in the description below. Drop it a follow please so it looks less like an embarrassment. Getting back to the action, and Charles Leclerc's Ferrari had been rebuilt following his Friday excursion into the wall, the Monegasque proceeding to almost do it again in his first flying lap of the session. While the Italians had seemingly returned to looking like feckless morons, their compatriots over at RB were having a much better morning. Yuki Tsunoda flying into P9 and Danny Rick ending up even higher up the board in P6. At least, according to Checo, he's back on form, and this won't put his seat at risk. Oh, never mind, the Mexican Minister of Delusion is 13th. Things really had to improve come qualifying, which looked set to have an extra element when talk of oncoming rain began to spread around the paddock. But this was a beautiful summer's day. It was 30 degrees, and David Croft had probably just been spiked again. But I hadn't brought a waterproof, so of course it f***ing rained. at what seemed to be just the final corner where I was sitting. On the bright side, that was going to make Q1 a lot more interesting, particularly so when Logan Sargent got out of the drop zone and the rest of the field found themselves under a lot more pressure. Daniel Ricciardo appeared to be the big name at risk, and with rumours rife that the Australian could replace Sergio Perez from the Dutch Grand Prix in a month's time, Checo had to ensure the Honey Badger remained in that drop zone. That's the only explanation I could find for the Mexican driving like a pisshead, rear-ending it into the wall and bringing out the red flag at a point where rain began to intensify. Either that, or this guy's even more of a f***ing clown than we originally thought. Oh, and if you're wondering where the meme's gone, let's be real, it was f***ing annoying, and no one really likes it anyway. Happy now? Let's move on. The session would resume, but now parts of the track were significantly damper than they were before. Somehow, that didn't stop drivers finding more time in the closing moments, Ricciardo saving himself by topping the session, while Sergio fell down to P16. Not that he'd be able to continue anyway, given his RB20 now resembles the back of John F. Kennedy's head. Alpine also found themselves in the drop zone as the team forgot that drying tracks tended to improve lap time. The French team's performance being almost as embarrassing as whatever the Mercedes were playing at. They opted to underfuel George Russell, then acted shocked when he ran out of fuel. That left the Austrian Grand Prix winner down in 17th for Sunday, and left another Austrian rather unhappy on the pit wall. That's okay at least, the tote bag here loves to go on about his no-blame policy. Oh, I don't remember much about Q2, partially due to me suffering with suspected heat stroke, and partially because all happened. Hamilton was almost knocked out by the Hulk, but the German opted to instead line up 11th on the grid, next to the man he's sent to the job centre for next year. That takes us on to Q3 then, and in a session that was so often dominated by Red Bull and Max Verstappen, here's the crowd's reaction when the Dutchman entered his run behind the McLarens in P3.
Yellow sector 2. Oh! Yuki!
So remember when I said Tsunoda was flying earlier? Well, now he was, just not quite so figuratively. Great marketing for F1 though, good job Yuki. Japanese pilots have a bit of a history when it comes to crashing, but this latest incident left the red flag out for a second time, and oh boy, here we go again. The chaos was only just beginning, however, as despite the session not being officially over, the Aston Martins were pulled into Parc Fermé. The warning signs really kicking off when Brad Pitt emerged from the car in front. Alonso here had actually stumbled upon a film set, who had somehow mistaken his green Aston Martin for one of the black Apex GP cars, maybe because it's so f***ing slow. Since Alonso was now in the process of getting out of his car, he was eliminated from taking part in the last minutes of qualifying, causing the Spaniard to strip in frustration. Back on the track, everyone was attempting to get one more run out of these now slightly suicidal soft tyres. The only car to improve was Ricciardo, who jumped ahead of the two-wheeled Tsunoda and into P9. That left pole to the man who had topped the session prior to Yuki's crash. That man being Lando Norris, meaning we had all night to theorise just how he'd throw a surefire win away this time. As the lights went out on Sunday, we got our answer relatively quickly. A poor start, dropping the Briton behind teammate Piastri and making him go side by side with Verstappen, which ended about as well as you might think. Max went off the road, then used his 3 AM Assetto Corsa lines to rejoin the track ahead of Lando. This created a bit of back and forth on the Dutchman's radio, race engineer GP suggesting the Dutchman hand the place back, receiving just a series of beeps in reply. Verstappen would eventually relent P2, but as you'll soon find out, this was far from over. Lap 17 saw Lewis Hamilton make his first stop for Mercedes, in doing so triggering an undercut which Red Bull either missed or ignored, as when they boxed 5 laps later, Hamilton was clear into a provisional P3. That Mercedes is still a distant relative to the spine-breaking W13 to the past though, and Verstappen was soon enough on the Silver Arrow's tail again. We were back in 2021 then, Hamilton v Verstappen and Max acting like a whiny little bitch. That can happen though when you game till 3 in the morning. How many Dutch fans are still here, do we reckon? Max's chance appeared to come on lap 35 when Lewis locked up into the first corner. The Red Bull pounced around the outside of turn 2, only for Verstappen's wheel to disconnect, and his race radio appearing to sound even more like Morse code. Red Bull could have saved the situation by triggering an undercut once again when it came round to their second round of pit stops, except they didn't do that and just allowed Mercedes to box Lewis first again. Is it just me, or does Hannah Schmidt's name sound a little bit too German to you? With the Orange Army now confuzzled with that conspiracy theory, let's turn our attention to the pair of McLarens out front. Oscar Piastri doing a storming job out in the lead and not looking like he's shitting himself whatsoever. That tiny incident aside, it appeared as if the Aussie's first proper F1 win was his to lose, or the McLaren strategy team's as it turned out. Lap 46 saw them make the rather peculiar choice of boxing Norris first, in a move described as covering off Lewis Hamilton, who was 8 seconds behind. With Lando now having a supreme advantage, the team needed to pit Piastri ASAP in order to avoid things getting rather awkward. Except they didn't do that and left him out for 2 further laps, and now this is going to get interesting, isn't it? So now McLaren were on a mission to themselves. Let's return to Max Verstappen, who was back on the tail of Hamilton and driving like 2021 Valtteri Bottas. The Dutchman appeared to forget turn 1 existed, lock up and drive straight into Hamilton, removing him from podium contention and making the reigning world champion rather angry. With GP now signed off on mental health leave, let's turn to the other radio drama happening down at McLaren. Will Joseph promising Lando as many special favours as he wanted if he'd let Piastri through and re-establish the original order. Funnily enough, Lando didn't want to do that, claiming he was in the championship battle, which will probably end up as the funniest joke in this comedy review. Admittedly, Piastri wasn't necessarily doing himself any favours either, needing to catch up to Norris, but instead going on a grand expedition into the Budapest gravel traps in the final sector. With matters getting desperate, Lando was told that the team would confiscate his Xbox for a week if he didn't let his teammate through. That was enough to convince the Briton to give up his second F1 win to allow Oscar to take his first. Hamilton rounding out the podium in a race that was so enthralling from start to finish. When exactly did Gasly retire? Let's start with the Lewis-Max incident, the stewards eventually ruling that while Hamilton could have done more to avoid the Red Bull missile streaming down the inside, the crash was still just a racing incident, leaving Twitter to do their thing and argue till the end of time. What's far more interesting to me about all this was Max's response in the interview pen post-race. He claimed that Hamilton moved under braking and how that wasn't allowed. Comments which went down about as well as if I made a video titled Top 10 Fatal F1 Crashes. Though seriously, I've genuinely lost so many brain cells listening to this, I now know what it must feel like to be Charles Leclerc. The McLaren chaos, on the other hand, is even more embarrassing, as quite frankly, it shouldn't have even happened in the first place. Norris acted like a man-child afterwards, throwing his hat on the floor in the cool-down room and triggering Lewis Hamilton's post-Rosberg stress disorder. After the podium ceremony, he appeared to have cooled off, claiming that he would have always made that move and that sometimes you've just got to put yourself in the other guy's shoes. I'm not sure he realises that team radios are played out on the public feed. It's a huge shame, really, that this all ends up taking away from a superb first victory for Oscar Piastri. I do wonder what would have happened if both these guys were gunning for their first win, though. But this video is already too long for that kind of speculation, and quite frankly, I'm f***ing tired. What I will say though is if you haven't visited the Grand Prix before, bloody well do it. I'm not even being sponsored this year to say that. This was a particularly mental weekend, so as I head home and begin to dream about you all liking and subscribing, I can do so in the peace that this chaos is finally over. Oh,